There are few names in history that shine with as much honor and greatness as Salahuddin Ayyubi. He was not born into glory, nor did he rise by chance. His greatness was forged through defeat, discipline, and deep faith. When the world thought his fall was final, he stood up with patience and turned his loss into a legacy. This is not just the story of a warrior, it is the story of a man whose heart was stronger than any sword, whose mercy was mightier than his army, and whose faith turned his first defeat into the foundation of his eternal victory. What if I told you that the most powerful kings in history were not the ones who never fell, but the ones who learned how to rise again? Salahuddin Ayyubi was once defeated, humiliated, and underestimated. But instead of breaking, he built himself through faith and wisdom. He didn't seek revenge through blood, he sought justice through patience. And when his time came, he didn't just reclaim his land, he reclaimed the honor of a nation. After the Battle of Montchesart, the air was thick with silence and sorrow. Salahuddin Ayyubi stood among his men, his armor stained with dust and exhaustion. The defeat was undeniable. The Crusaders had struck fiercely, and his army had suffered heavily. Yet in his eyes there was no panic, no sign of despair, only deep reflection. He knew that every setback carried within it a hidden message, a divine wisdom that only patience could reveal. Where others saw humiliation, Salahuddin saw an opportunity for growth, for introspection, and for spiritual renewal. As he retreated toward Egypt, his heart was heavy, not because of the loss, but because he felt he had not yet fulfilled his responsibility to unite and protect the Ummah. The long journey back gave him time to think, to replay every command, every move, every misstep in his mind. And like ordinary leaders who would cast blame, Salahuddin placed the weight of responsibility upon himself. He did not curse fate or question Allah's will. Instead, he whispered prayers of gratitude that his life and the lives of many of his men were spared, knowing that as long as they breathed, the mission continued. Nights in the desert became his classroom. Beneath the endless stars, he would sit quietly in reflection, the cool air brushing against his face as he thought about the purpose behind his defeat. Salahuddin believed that no event, victory, or loss happened without the permission of Allah. Each moment carried a test, and this loss, though bitter, was a test of patience, resilience, and leadership. It was not a sign of Allah's displeasure, but a reminder that faith is proven in times of adversity, not in times of ease. When he gathered his commanders, their faces showed signs of defeat and confusion. Yet Salahuddin's tone was calm and steady. He reminded them that the measure of a man is not determined by how he acts when everything goes right, but by how he stands when everything falls apart. Allah is with the steadfast, he told them, echoing the words of the Quran. Those words pierced through despair like a sword through armor, reigniting faith in their hearts. His calmness became their courage, his faith became their light. Despite the pain of defeat, Salahuddin did not allow bitterness to cloud his heart. He understood that anger blinds judgment, and revenge without wisdom leads to destruction. Instead, he chose the path of understanding. He analyzed the Crusaders' strategies with respect, learning from their methods without envy. He studied how discipline, communication, and unity among them had given them an edge. But more importantly, he reflected on how disunity among Muslims had weakened his own side. His introspection was not about self-pity, it was about finding the root of the problem. As the days passed, his reflection turned into resolve. Salahuddin began writing down his thoughts, lessons learned from the defeat, ideas for strengthening his army, and principles for rebuilding the morale of his people. He wrote not as a defeated warrior, but as a student of experience. To him, defeat was not the end of the road. It was the beginning of wisdom. Every scar on the battlefield became a verse in his unseen book of leadership. He realized that true victory begins not on the field, but within the heart. He also took time to tend to his men. Many were wounded, both physically and emotionally. Salahuddin visited their tents personally, speaking to them with kindness and humility. He listened to their fears, comforted their hearts, and reminded them that they were chosen by Allah to fight in His cause. His compassion reawakened their sense of purpose. They began to see that they were part of something greater than a single battle, that their mission was far beyond revenge. It was about defending truth, justice, and faith. During one evening prayer, Salahuddin stood behind his men, leading them in Salah. As they bowed and prostrated, the quiet echo of their devotion filled the camp. In that moment, he felt a deep sense of peace. Though defeated in war, he felt victorious in faith. He understood that Allah grants victory to whom He wills, and sometimes the greatest victories come after moments of loss. His faith gave him a serenity that no enemy could destroy. He knew his time would come again, but only when he was ready in both spirit and strength. When they finally reached Egypt, Salahuddin gathered his most trusted advisors and spoke not of revenge but of renewal. He emphasized that before any future campaign could succeed, they needed unity, preparation, and divine blessing. His words were firm yet filled with wisdom. "We have lost a battle," he said, "but we have not lost our honor, and as long as our hearts are alive with faith, no defeat can destroy us." His men felt a surge of hope, realizing that they followed a man whose vision stretched far beyond the dust of one battlefield. In the quiet that followed the chaos of war, Salahuddin's mind became sharper and his heart stronger. The loss at Montchesard had burned away pride, leaving behind humility and purpose. It was as if Allah had stripped him of temporary victory to prepare him for eternal greatness. Salahuddin emerged from that moment not as a defeated soldier, but as a purified leader, one who had faced humiliation without losing dignity, faced loss without losing hope, and faced despair without losing faith. This was not the end of his story, it was the divine beginning of one of the greatest comebacks in history. In the months that followed his defeat, Salahuddin Ayyubi turned his pain into purpose. He began reorganizing his forces with a level of precision that astonished those around him. Every man, every horse, every sword was accounted for. He understood that discipline was not just about strength. It was about unity of intention. His army would not only fight for land, they would fight for justice, for honor, and for the defense of the truth. Salahuddin knew that a scattered force could not defeat a disciplined enemy, so he built not just an army, but a brotherhood, one bound by faith and guided by divine purpose. He spent long hours with his commanders, not as a king issuing orders, but as a teacher shaping minds. He taught them that victory begins with belief, not weapons. A soldier who fights only for reward loses heart when hardship strikes, but one who fights for Allah never surrenders. He reminded them that the Crusaders' success was not due to their might alone, but to their unity under one command. And so he made unity his first mission. Tribal rivalries and personal ambitions had weakened the Muslim armies before, but under Salahuddin's leadership, those divisions began to fade. While others saw the defeat as a reason to slow down, Salahuddin saw it as the fire that would forge a stronger will. He began strengthening his military bases in Egypt and Syria, improving training, logistics, and morale. His men learned to move swiftly, to adapt to any terrain, and to rely on discipline more than sheer numbers. Salahuddin instilled in them the principle that preparation was part of faith. He would often say that tawakkul, trust in Allah, does not mean sitting idle. It means striving with excellence and leaving the outcome to Him. The rebuilding was not just military, it was moral and spiritual. Salahuddin knew that the hearts of his people needed to burn again with faith and conviction. He repaired mosques, supported scholars, and promoted justice among his people. When they saw their ruler living simply, praying with humility, and caring for the poor, their love and loyalty deepened. He was not a king distant from his people. He was one of them, sharing their burdens and reminding them that their struggle was for the sake of something far greater than personal glory. Salahuddin was also a man of patience. He did not rush into another war immediately, even when many urged him to seek quick revenge. He knew that an unprepared strike would only repeat the same mistake. Instead, he waited, watching his enemies, studying their movements, and planning meticulously. Every delay had a purpose. Every decision was guided by both wisdom and prayer. He knew that haste often leads to ruin, but patience leads to perfection. His strategy was a blend of intellect, restraint, and faith, a balance only true leaders can maintain. He began forming alliances with Muslim rulers who had once stood apart. His humility and sincerity won their hearts. He didn't demand allegiance through fear, he inspired it through trust. Leaders who once doubted him now stood beside him, united in a single cause. Salahuddin knew that only a united Ummah could stand against the might of the Crusaders. The bond of brotherhood he created stretched across lands, tribes, and languages, a unity built not on politics, but on faith. While building his forces, Salahuddin also focused on intelligence and communication. He sent scouts to monitor Crusader movements, studied their fortresses, and understood their patterns. His knowledge became his weapon. He realized that war is not won merely with swords, but with foresight. He used information as his shield, turning what once was a weakness into an advantage. Every message, every whisper, every sign was analyzed. The mind of Salahuddin became a map of strategy, a reflection of wisdom gained from experience and reflection. The people around him noticed the change in him. The defeat had humbled him, but it had also sharpened him. He spoke less, but every word carried weight. His soldiers said that when Salahuddin walked through the camps, morale rose instantly. His presence reminded them of courage, and his eyes carried the calm of a man who knew his destiny was written by Allah himself. The men believed that with him no defeat could last because their leader's faith was unshakable. As the months turned into years, Salahuddin's new army began to take form, a force unlike any before it. Trained in both discipline and devotion, his men were ready not only to fight but to endure. They no longer fought for personal gain or fame. They fought for the honor of Islam and the defense of the oppressed. Salahuddin often reminded them, victory is not in our hands, it is in Allah's decree, but effort, sincerity, and steadfastness are our duties. These words became the soul of his army. Through his tireless preparation, Salahuddin transformed defeat into foundation. The war he lost had not broken him, it had rebuilt him. Every hardship, every sacrifice became a step towards something greater. He had learned that revenge without preparation is emotion, but revenge with patience and wisdom is destiny. He was no longer the same man who had faced defeat. He was a reborn warrior, guided not by pride, but by purpose. The world would soon witness not just the rise of an army, but the rise of a legend who would restore honor to his faith and justice to the land. When Salahuddin began his campaign of revival, he understood that revenge alone could not bring true victory. Only justice and faith could. He began to re-establish control across the fragmented Muslim lands, moving strategically from one stronghold to another. His goal was not immediate conquest but long-term unity. Every territory he reclaimed was a step toward a greater purpose, a united ummah that would stand firm against tyranny. As he moved forward, he carried with him not only his sword, but his unwavering belief that Allah grants victory to those who uphold truth and patience. He started his movement in Egypt, strengthening its defenses and restoring order after years of division and corruption. Salahuddin rooted out injustice with firmness, but always maintained mercy. He appointed honest governors, established fair taxation, and ensured that wealth circulated among the people rather than being hoarded by the elite. His rule was marked by fairness, and his humility won him the trust of the people. They saw in him not a conqueror seeking power, but a leader seeking righteousness. This trust became the foundation upon which he built his empire. From Egypt, he turned his focus towards Syria, a region of immense strategic and spiritual importance. Damascus, with its long history and sacred legacy, became one of his primary objectives. The people there, weary from political conflict, welcomed Salahuddin not with fear but with admiration. His reputation as a just ruler had spread far and wide. He didn't enter cities with destruction, but with discipline. His army moved with restraint, avoiding harm to innocents and protecting the sanctity of homes and places of worship. His leadership reflected his faith, showing that a true warrior is also a servant of justice. As he unified one city after another, Salahuddin continued to remind his followers that their strength came not from weapons or numbers, but from their adherence to faith. In every speech, he would begin by invoking the name of Allah and end by urging patience and sincerity. He often said that hearts filled with sincerity could overcome walls made of stone. His soldiers began to see their struggle as an act of worship, not just warfare. This spiritual unity gave them courage beyond measure, for they fought not for themselves, but for a cause greater than life itself. Salahuddin also knew that sustaining his growing empire required wisdom in governance as much as strength in battle. He built alliances with scholars, judges, and spiritual leaders, ensuring that every decision was grounded in knowledge and justice. He opened schools and supported scholars who taught both the Quran and worldly sciences. By doing so, he revived the intellectual and moral fabric of society. His vision was to build a civilization, not merely win a war. The more his influence spread, the stronger the moral foundation of his rule became. He remained cautious, however, knowing that unity was fragile and enemies were vigilant. The Crusaders continued to watch his every move, hoping to exploit divisions among Muslim leaders. But Salahuddin's diplomacy was as sharp as his sword. He used wisdom where others would use aggression and patience where others would act in haste. He negotiated when it served justice and fought when it was necessary. His balance of strategy and faith made him a formidable leader, one who could outthink his opponents long before he outfought them. Each city he liberated strengthened the morale of the Muslim world. People from distant lands began to write letters pledging their support. His name became synonymous with hope and courage. Mothers told their children stories of his bravery, and scholars prayed for his victory. The echo of his efforts reached across borders, but Salahuddin never let praise enter his heart. He remained humble, always crediting success to Allah's will. Even in moments of triumph, he would be found in prayer, thanking his Creator for guidance and strength. As his empire expanded, Salahuddin focused on preparing for the inevitable confrontation with the Crusaders who still held Jerusalem. He knew that the city was not just a political goal but a spiritual trust. Its liberation would require more than war. It would require faith, discipline, and sacrifice. He began strengthening supply lines, building fortresses, and training his army to fight with both skill and restraint. Every campaign he led became a test of endurance and faith, and his soldiers began to embody his character: disciplined, loyal, and merciful. His leadership inspired even his enemies to respect him. Crusader knights who faced him in battle spoke of his chivalry and fairness. He would often treat captured foes with mercy, offering them safety when he could have easily sought vengeance. His sense of justice transcended borders. This behavior, deeply rooted in his Islamic principles, distinguished him from the rest. Even those who opposed him knew they were facing not just a general, but a man of honor guided by divine purpose. By this stage, Salahuddin's transformation from a defeated commander to a unifier of nations was complete. Every region he reclaimed, every alliance he built, and every reform he made became part of a larger tapestry of revival. The once divided lands of Islam now had one leader to follow and one cause to serve. The pain of his first defeat had birthed a determination that could no longer be broken. He had turned his earlier loss into the fuel that powered an empire built on faith, justice, and unity, a foundation upon which his greatest victory was soon to rise. When Salahuddin had finally united much of the Muslim world under one banner, he turned his eyes toward the great test that awaited him, the Crusaders who still held the blessed city of Jerusalem. His heart burned with the desire to restore it to its rightful place, not out of pride or revenge, but out of devotion to Allah and love for his sacred trust. Yet, before launching any major campaign, he took careful steps. He strengthened his army's discipline, reviewed every strategy, and sought counsel from scholars and commanders. Salahuddin knew that rushing into battle without preparation was not courage, it was recklessness. He prayed for guidance, believing that victory would come only when their hearts were pure and their intentions sincere. He began by observing the Crusaders' behavior along the borders of his territories. They had grown arrogant after years of holding the Holy Land. They underestimated Salahuddin, thinking he would never rise again after his earlier defeats. But they were unaware that the man they mocked had become far stronger, wiser, and more united in purpose. Salahuddin used their overconfidence as a weapon. He began cutting off their supply lines and reclaiming smaller fortresses that fed into the larger Crusader strongholds. Every victory, no matter how small, weakened their morale and tightened his control. The Crusaders soon realized that Salahuddin was not the same leader they once faced. His strategies were now precise and deeply calculated. He struck where they least expected, and his army moved swiftly through difficult terrain. His understanding of the land was unmatched, and his men followed him with absolute trust. Salahuddin made sure that his troops never lost sight of their true purpose. They were not fighting for wealth or glory, but for the defense of truth and the liberation of the oppressed. Each battle became an act of faith, and each victory a reminder that perseverance was rewarded by divine help. Salahuddin's leadership during this period became a model of both strength and compassion. When Crusader villages fell under his control, he forbade unnecessary bloodshed. He treated prisoners with fairness and gave protection to women and children. His character stood in stark contrast to the cruelty that many of his enemies had shown to Muslims in previous wars. News of his mercy spread quickly, even among the Crusaders. Some of their commanders began to see him not as a barbarian enemy, but as a noble and honorable leader. His conduct became a silent form of dawah, a living example of Islamic justice. As the Crusaders' grip on the region weakened, Salahuddin focused his attention on one decisive confrontation, the Battle of Hattin. He knew that the outcome of this battle would shape the future of the Holy Land. For months, he prepared his army, ensuring they had enough supplies, rest, and morale to withstand the coming test. On the day of the battle, his forces faced the Crusader army under King Guy of Jerusalem. The sun burned fiercely, and the Crusaders struggled for water, while Salahuddin's men remained disciplined and patient. It was as if every hardship he had endured before had led to this moment. Through brilliant strategy, Salahuddin surrounded the Crusaders near the hills of Hattin. His soldiers cut off their access to water and slowly tightened their formation. The Crusader army, thirsty and exhausted, could no longer maintain their structure. Salahuddin's cavalry struck with precision, breaking their lines and capturing many of their leaders. It was one of the most decisive victories in medieval history. The Christian army that once dominated the region was shattered. This victory was not just a military triumph. It was a turning point that reignited hope across the Muslim world. Despite the overwhelming victory, Salahuddin's heart remained humble. He ordered that prisoners be treated kindly and reminded his men that their victory came by the will of Allah, not by their swords. Even King Guy, his captured enemy, was treated with dignity. Such acts of mercy after such a massive victory revealed the depth of Salahuddin's character. He showed the world that true power lies not in cruelty, but in restraint and justice. His behavior reflected the prophetic example: mercy in victory, humility in triumph, and gratitude in success. The news of Hattin spread like wildfire across the lands of Islam. People celebrated, tears of joy flowing as they praised Allah for answering their prayers. The Crusaders, on the other hand, were struck with fear and disbelief. Their once unshakable control over Jerusalem now trembled under the might of Salahuddin's faith-driven army. He knew that the door to the holy city was now open, but he did not rush to enter. He chose to strengthen his hold on surrounding territories first, ensuring that when he moved toward Jerusalem, no enemy could strike him from behind. His patience once again proved to be his greatest weapon. In the months that followed, Salahuddin continued to demonstrate his brilliance. He managed to recapture several key cities, including Acre and Ascalon, each victory bringing him closer to Jerusalem. His soldiers, once weary from endless war, now fought with renewed spirit. They saw in their leader a man who embodied courage, wisdom, and unshakable faith. They believed that under his command, no wall was too strong, no army too great, and no obstacle impossible to overcome. Salahuddin had become more than a general. He was the soul of the Muslim struggle. By the time he stood before Jerusalem's walls, the Crusaders were no longer the proud conquerors they once were. They saw in Salahuddin a leader of divine purpose, whose actions spoke louder than his armies. His campaign was not driven by vengeance for the losses of the past, but by the dream of restoring peace and justice to a sacred land. Every lesson he had learned from defeat, every hardship he had endured, had prepared him for this moment. The world now watched as the man who once faced loss with patience prepared to reclaim the city that would make him a legend for all time. When Salahuddin finally approached Jerusalem, the air was thick with both fear and hope. The The Crusaders, who had once ruled the holy city with an iron hand, now stood trembling behind its walls. They remembered their own cruelty when they first conquered it decades earlier, how they had filled its streets with blood and desecrated its sanctuaries. But this time the man at the gates was different. Salahuddin was not driven by vengeance, he was guided by justice and mercy. As his army encamped around Jerusalem, he offered the Crusaders a chance to surrender peacefully, promising safety for all who laid down their arms. It was a moment that showed his greatness, power tempered with compassion. The defenders of Jerusalem, however, hesitated. They feared that if they surrendered, their people would be slaughtered as they themselves had slaughtered Muslims in the past. They prepared for battle, hoping for a miracle that would never come. Salahuddin, patient as always, did not rush to destroy the city. He understood that victory without humanity would not be true victory. He ordered his troops to maintain discipline and forbade any act of cruelty. Even in war, his heart remained anchored in faith, knowing that justice was the true path to victory. When the final assault came, Salahuddin's strategy was measured and deliberate. His soldiers surrounded the city, cutting off supplies and forcing the Crusaders into negotiation. After days of resistance, the city's leaders realized that further fighting would only bring suffering to their people. They sent envoys to Salahuddin pleading for terms of surrender. Many expected him to demand revenge for the massacres of the past, but what he offered instead stunned the world. He agreed to spare all lives, allow safe passage for those who wished to leave, and protect the Christian holy sites within the city. Such mercy was unheard of in an age defined by brutality. When Jerusalem finally surrendered in 1187, Salahuddin entered the city not as a conqueror seeking glory, but as a servant of Allah fulfilling a sacred duty. He dismounted his horse at the gates and walked humbly toward Al-Aqsa Mosque, tears in his eyes. After more than 80 years under foreign rule, the adhan once again echoed across the city. It was a moment of divine triumph, not born from pride, but from faith, patience, and righteousness. His soldiers, seeing their leader's humility, fell to their knees in gratitude. Jerusalem was free once more, not through arrogance, but through the power of belief. What made Salahuddin's conquest truly remarkable was the way he treated his former enemies. He ensured that Christian civilians could leave safely, protecting their families and belongings. Those who could not afford ransom were released freely. Many women and children wept, unable to believe that the same people they had once oppressed now showed them mercy. This act of compassion echoed across continents. Even the European chroniclers, enemies of Islam, wrote with awe about Salahuddin's generosity and honor. His behavior became the ultimate embodiment of justice guided by divine principle. The return of Jerusalem under Salahuddin's care also marked the revival of spiritual life. He ordered the purification and restoration of Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, which the Crusaders had defiled. The city once again became a center of faith and scholarship. Scholars, poets, and worshippers flocked to Jerusalem, bringing with them the light of knowledge and devotion. Salahuddin personally oversaw the rebuilding of schools and institutions, ensuring that education and justice flourished side by side. His rule was not about domination, it was about restoration, bringing the city back to the peace it had lost for decades. His mercy even touched the hearts of his enemies. When news of his conduct reached Europe, many Christians could not believe it. Some Crusader knights who had escaped the battle wrote that Salahuddin was more honorable than their own kings. Even King Richard the Lionheart, who would later fight against him, came to respect his character deeply. It was said that they saw in Salahuddin a warrior who fought fiercely but never without purpose, a man who valued faith over fury. Through his character, he showed the world that Islam was not a religion of vengeance but of justice and compassion. For Salahuddin, victory was not just reclaiming a city, it was proving that righteousness always triumphs over oppression. He reminded his soldiers that they were not to become what they once fought against. He forbade looting, cruelty, and arrogance. His men followed his example, treating the citizens of Jerusalem with kindness and dignity. Even in the aftermath of one of the greatest victories in history, Salahuddin's humility remained unchanged. He continued to live simply, giving away wealth to the poor and maintaining his devotion to Allah above all else. The liberation of Jerusalem became a symbol of hope not only for Muslims, but for all who admired justice. It showed that power can coexist with mercy, and that faith can overcome even the strongest of enemies. The Muslim world rejoiced, and poets and scholars across lands wrote verses in his honor. Yet, Salahuddin refused any titles that exalted his ego. He considered himself only a servant chosen by Allah to fulfill a sacred duty. His humility, even in the face of unmatched success, became the hallmark of his greatness. In the years that followed, Salahuddin continued to defend his empire with the same balance of strength and compassion. But the recapture of Jerusalem remained his crowning achievement, a moment where patience, faith, and strategy all converged. It was not just a military victory, it was a moral one. He had reclaimed not only a city but the dignity of an entire civilization. Through his example, generations would learn that true greatness is not measured by conquest alone, but by the justice and mercy one shows in victory. After reclaiming Jerusalem, Salahuddin Ayyubi did not allow triumph to cloud his vision. He knew that the Crusaders, humiliated by their loss, would soon regroup and return with even greater force. The Christian world in Europe was in shock, but also in fury. Kings and knights who had once fought among themselves now united under the call of a new crusade. Salahuddin understood that this victory was not the end. It was the beginning of an even greater test. His wisdom told him that the true challenge was not conquering cities, but preserving what he had liberated. He began fortifying his defenses across the Holy Land, strengthening every fortress and outpost that surrounded Jerusalem. He reorganized his troops, ensured steady supply lines, and appointed loyal commanders to key positions. Salahuddin was not just preparing for war, he was preparing for endurance. He taught his men that the coming battles would demand not only strength, but also patience and unity. He often reminded them that victory belonged not to the largest army, but to those whose hearts were steadfast in faith. Every decision he made reflected a deep awareness that his true reliance was upon Allah alone. Meanwhile, across Europe, a new crusade was forming, one unlike any before. Kings from England, France, and Germany answered the papal call to reclaim Jerusalem. Among them was King Richard I of England, known to history as Richard the Lionheart. He was a warrior of immense courage, skilled in strategy, and driven by pride and religious zeal. Salahuddin knew that facing such an opponent would not be easy. Yet he did not fear him. He respected his bravery but placed his trust in divine justice. His heart remained calm, his mind clear, and his strategy firm. When the Crusaders arrived in the Holy Land, they struck with power and precision. They captured coastal cities and sought to isolate Jerusalem from the sea. Salahuddin's forces were tested severely, and for the first time since his great victory, the balance of power shifted. Yet, even in these trials, Salahuddin's composure never wavered. He adapted to each setback with remarkable patience. He retreated when necessary, advanced when possible, and always preserved the morale of his men. To him, a temporary loss was not a defeat, it was a lesson in endurance. The battles that followed between Salahuddin and Richard the Lionheart became legendary. Each respected the other deeply, for they both embodied the highest codes of chivalry in their respective traditions. Salahuddin admired Richard's courage, and Richard respected Salahuddin's mercy and honor. Their confrontations were fierce but marked by mutual respect. When Richard fell ill, Salahuddin sent him fresh fruit and medicine, showing compassion even toward his greatest enemy. This act astonished the Crusaders. It was proof that Salahuddin's greatness went beyond the battlefield. His nobility of character turned even his adversaries into admirers. Throughout these campaigns, Salahuddin's leadership continued to inspire his followers. He moved among his men not as a distant ruler, but as a companion in hardship. He ate the same food they ate, slept under the same sky, and shared their pain. This humility created an unbreakable bond between him and his soldiers. They did not follow him out of fear, but out of love and trust. They knew that their leader was fighting not for worldly gain, but for the sake of justice and truth. His army stood firm even in the most difficult moments because they shared in his purpose. As the war dragged on, both sides suffered great losses. The Crusaders realized that despite their might, they could not break Salahuddin's strength or his will. His defensive tactics wore them down, his patience confused them, and his faith gave him endless resilience. Even when the Crusaders captured some cities, Salahuddin would regroup, counterattack, and reclaim them. His ability to maintain balance under extreme pressure made him a figure of awe and respect. He showed that true leadership is not about never falling, it's about rising stronger every time you do. When the time came for negotiation, Salahuddin once again displayed the same mercy that had defined his entire life. He agreed to a truce with Richard, allowing Christian pilgrims safe passage to Jerusalem. The agreement ensured peace after years of devastating conflict. Both leaders recognized the futility of endless bloodshed and the necessity of mutual respect. For Salahuddin, it was never about destroying his enemies. It was about restoring justice and allowing peace to breathe again. His decision reflected deep spiritual wisdom. He preferred peace with honor over war without end. The truce between Salahuddin and Richard became a symbol of how even enemies could find respect in the midst of conflict. It was said that when the agreement was signed, Richard remarked that he could not have lost Jerusalem to a nobler enemy. Salahuddin's name began to be spoken across Europe with admiration rather than hatred. Knights told stories of his generosity and honor, poets praised his fairness, and even kings sought to emulate his example. Through his character, he achieved what no sword could ever secure. He conquered hearts. Salahuddin's patience during this long struggle defined his legacy. He had faced powerful kings, vast armies, and countless trials, yet he never wavered in faith. Each challenge only deepened his reliance on Allah and strengthened his resolve. His revenge for earlier defeats had long transformed into a mission of justice and mercy. Though he stood against the greatest powers of his time, his true strength came from his humility before his Creator. In every battle, every decision, and every act of mercy, Salahuddin Ayyubi proved that the greatest victories are not won by force, but by faith, honor, and steadfastness in the truth. When the Crusaders realized that defeating Salahuddin Ayyubi on the battlefield was nearly impossible, they turned to strategy and endurance. They began fortifying their captured coastal cities, cutting off trade routes, and wearing down the Muslim forces through a prolonged campaign. Yet Salahuddin's patience outlasted their plans. He never acted out of desperation or anger. Instead, he waited for the right moment, observing their every move with sharp intelligence. His belief in divine timing gave him the strength to remain calm when others might have panicked. He often told his commanders that haste brings mistakes, but patience brings victory. In the midst of this exhausting war, Salahuddin's leadership shone brightest. He kept his army united when food was scarce, when fatigue weighed heavily, and when morale could easily have collapsed. His men saw in him a living example of courage. Even when they were outnumbered or cornered, he inspired them with his quiet strength. He reminded them that no struggle is lost when one fights for a righteous cause. His presence alone could restore the will to fight in the hearts of his soldiers. They believed in him because he believed in Allah's plan more than in his own strength. The Crusaders tried every tactic to provoke Salahuddin into rash decisions. They launched surprise attacks, spread false rumors, and even attempted to negotiate under deceitful pretenses. Yet Salahuddin remained unmoved. He had learned long ago that anger blinds the wise and that calmness is a weapon sharper than any sword. His ability to see beyond the immediate moment gave him an advantage over enemies who acted out of pride and impulse. His wisdom turned the tide in ways that brute force never could. During one of the most intense phases of the war, Salahuddin suffered a series of small territorial losses. For any other ruler, this might have broken their spirit, but for him, it was a test. He viewed every setback as an opportunity for reflection and renewal. He would spend his nights in prayer, seeking guidance rather than complaining about his burdens. His generals often found him awake at dawn, studying maps and planning strategies while others slept. This deep connection between faith and action was the secret to his unshakable endurance. He understood that effort without trust in Allah is arrogance, but trust without effort is negligence. His patience was not weakness, it was his greatest power. When the Crusaders expected him to strike in anger, he waited. When they thought he would retreat in fear, he advanced with precision. He knew when to hold ground and when to withdraw, never letting pride dictate his moves. This balance between restraint and boldness made him unpredictable to his enemies. It taught his soldiers that true leadership is not about chasing every battle, it's about choosing the right ones. His calm determination became the anchor of his army amid chaos. Eventually, Salahuddin's perseverance began to bear fruit. The Crusaders grew weary. Their supplies dwindled, and divisions arose among their leaders. Salahuddin's patience had slowly dismantled their unity. Where swords had failed, endurance succeeded. It was as if his restraint had turned time itself into his ally. His forces began reclaiming lost territories one by one. His steady approach transformed the tides of war until the Crusaders found themselves fighting only to survive. The once confident invaders now feared the man who seemed never to tire, never to falter, never to lose hope. What set Salahuddin apart was not just his strategy but his humanity. Even in the hardest times, he never let cruelty enter his heart. Captured prisoners were treated with dignity, wounded enemies were cared for, and civilians were protected. These acts confused his opponents, who expected revenge but found compassion instead. His moral conduct weakened the Crusaders' resolve more than any sword could. It made them question their own motives and admire the character of the man they had come to destroy. One of the most remarkable moments came when Richard the Lionheart, Salahuddin's greatest adversary, fell seriously ill. Instead of celebrating his enemy's weakness, Salahuddin sent him fruit, medicine, and his personal physician. This gesture shocked both armies. It showed that even in war, Salahuddin's heart remained guided by mercy. His compassion did not diminish his strength. It amplified it. It reminded the world that true victory lies in maintaining humanity, even against one's enemies. As months turned into years, Salahuddin's patience reshaped the entire conflict. His consistency eroded the arrogance of his opponents and inspired awe across both sides. Soldiers spoke of him not just as a general, but as a man of divine purpose. His calm in adversity, his refusal to surrender to despair, and his unwavering sense of justice turned him into a living legend. Even those who opposed him could not deny his greatness. He had proven that steadfastness is not merely a tactic, it is a form of worship. In the end, Salahuddin's endurance achieved what no sudden victory could. The Crusaders, exhausted and fragmented, sought peace on his terms. His long patience had defeated armies, kings, and pride itself. Through his example, he taught that victory earned through endurance carries far more honor than one gained through fury. His legacy became eternal because his strength came from within, from his faith, his discipline, and his unbreakable spirit. He showed that the greatest conqueror is not the one who overcomes others, but the one who masters himself in the face of every storm. When the time finally came for Salahuddin Ayyubi to launch his counterattack, he did so not out of vengeance, but out of justice. The years of patience, endurance, and strategic wisdom had prepared him for this moment. Every loss he had endured, every hardship he had faced, became the foundation of his strength. His army, disciplined and united, stood behind him with unwavering loyalty. They did not march for conquest or fame, they marched to reclaim dignity, faith, and peace. Salahuddin's presence on the battlefield radiated calm authority, as if he already knew victory was written by the will of Allah. His first move was not a reckless strike, but a carefully planned assault on the Crusaders' supply lines. He understood that true victory came not from chaos but from control. The Crusaders, accustomed to sudden raids and impulsive warfare, could not match his patience or precision. They watched helplessly as their strongholds weakened one by one. Salahuddin's strategies were like the steady beating of a war drum, never too fast, never too slow, always deliberate. His ability to stay composed, even in the most intense battles, became a lesson in discipline for generations to come. Every step Salahuddin took in battle was guided by both intellect and faith. Before every major offensive, he would gather his commanders, seek their counsel, and then raise his hands in prayer. His soldiers often said that when Salahuddin prayed before battle, they felt a wave of peace settle over them, even in the face of death. This blend of spiritual strength and tactical mastery made him unlike any leader of his time. His men didn't fight merely because they were commanded to. They fought because they believed in the righteousness of their cause. As the battles raged on, Salahuddin's army began reclaiming key fortresses that had once been lost. The morale of his soldiers soared as they witnessed how patience and persistence had transformed their fortunes. They remembered the days when they had been pushed back and humiliated, and now they stood victorious under the same sky where they once retreated. Salahuddin's leadership reminded them that the cycle of loss and victory belongs to those who never give up. His calm confidence spread like fire among his ranks, turning exhaustion into energy and fear into faith. The Crusaders, once arrogant and unified, began to crumble under pressure. They could not understand how the same man they thought broken years ago had returned with such power and control. Salahuddin's armies moved with purpose, coordinated and disciplined, while the enemy forces fractured under doubt. Every failed counterattack by the Crusaders only strengthened Salahuddin's position. It was as if the patience he had shown for years had ripened into a force of destiny, now unfolding before the eyes of friend and foe alike. One of the defining moments came at the Battle of Hattin, where Salahuddin's forces surrounded the Crusader army near the scorching plains of Tiberias. The enemy, deprived of water and exhausted, fell into despair. Salahuddin, ever the strategist, had used both nature and discipline to his advantage. When the battle began, his men fought not with rage, but with precision. The Crusader ranks collapsed, their banners fell, and their morale broke. In a single day, years of pain and preparation bore fruit, but even in triumph, Salahuddin's heart remained humble. He saw victory not as his doing, but as a blessing granted by Allah. After the crushing defeat of the Crusaders, Salahuddin displayed a level of mercy that astonished the world. While others might have sought revenge, he offered forgiveness. The captives were treated with dignity, women and children were spared. His actions spoke louder than any words. He showed that greatness lies not in destruction, but in restraint. His mercy became more powerful than any weapon, and even his enemies began to speak his name with respect. It was this unmatched compassion that turned his revenge into redemption. When news of Salahuddin's victory spread, it reached across continents. Muslims rejoiced, and even those who were once indifferent to the war began to revere him as a symbol of faith and honor. His victories were not just military triumphs, they were moral victories that uplifted the hearts of millions. Salahuddin's success rekindled the belief that truth and justice always prevail in the end. He had not only reclaimed cities, but had restored hope to his people. His revenge was not born of hatred, but of the desire to see righteousness restored. What made Salahuddin's revenge so extraordinary was that it was guided by balance. He knew that anger leads to ruin, but discipline leads to glory. His revenge was measured, purposeful, and aligned with divine justice. He conquered not to boast, but to heal what had been wounded. Each step of his campaign reflected wisdom rather than wrath. His restraint transformed him from a mere warrior into a legend, proving that true revenge is not about destruction, it's about restoration. In the end, Salahuddin's triumph was not just over his enemies, but over his own ego. He emerged victorious because he never allowed bitterness to consume him. His revenge was pure, born from endurance, faith, and purpose. The world witnessed a man who turned defeat into determination, patience into power, and vengeance into virtue. His story became a timeless reminder that when faith governs the heart, even revenge can become an act of justice, mercy, and divine fulfillment. As Salahuddin's victories began to shape the future of the region, the hearts of his people swelled with admiration and unity. His leadership had not only reclaimed land, but also revived the soul of an entire nation. What began as a campaign of recovery after defeat transformed into a movement of purpose and faith. The once fragmented Muslim world started to unite under his banner, bound by a shared belief that righteousness could triumph over oppression. This newfound unity became Salahuddin's greatest weapon, more powerful than any sword or army. He inspired not through fear, but through conviction, reminding his people that when they stood together for truth, no enemy could overpower them. His character continued to shine even as power and fame surrounded him. Unlike many rulers who became arrogant after victory, Salahuddin remained humble, grounded by the memory of his early defeats. He often reminded his generals that success was not achieved by their strength alone, but through the guidance and mercy of Allah. In the quiet moments between battles, he would sit with scholars and imams, discussing matters of justice and moral duty. He understood that the strength of a kingdom lay not just in its armies, but in the righteousness of its leaders. This combination of humility and wisdom turned him into a ruler admired not just by his people, but even by his adversaries. Salahuddin's conduct towards his enemies revealed his true greatness. After defeating the Crusaders, he did not resort to cruelty or vengeance. Instead, he allowed many of them to live peacefully, provided they accepted the laws of the land. The women, children, and elderly among the captives were treated with respect. This act of compassion shocked even his rivals, who had expected bloodshed and brutality. The world had seen conquerors before, but none like Salahuddin, one who could hold a sword in one hand and mercy in the other. His justice became the foundation of his reign, proving that true strength lies in control over one's anger and desires. Even the leaders of the Crusaders, who once vowed to destroy him, began to acknowledge his nobility. There are accounts of Christian knights praising his generosity, speaking of him as a man of honor rather than an enemy. Salahuddin's name began to cross borders not as a figure of fear, but as a symbol of fairness. This was a rare achievement in the age of war, a Muslim leader earning the respect of his opponents through his integrity. His reputation became so powerful that it deterred future aggression. People began to realize that Salahuddin was not just defending his land, but upholding principles that transcended religion and politics. With Jerusalem reclaimed, Salahuddin faced the immense challenge of maintaining peace in a region scarred by decades of conflict. He managed this through diplomacy and patience. Instead of imposing harsh rule, he sought to create harmony among diverse communities. Christians, Jews, and Muslims were allowed to live and worship freely, each under the protection of law. His governance proved that coexistence was possible under justice and fairness. This tolerance elevated Salahuddin beyond the image of a conqueror. He became a builder of civilizations and a guardian of moral order. Despite the endless burdens of leadership, Salahuddin remained devoted to a simple and modest life. He rejected luxury and personal wealth, choosing instead to serve his people. Even when immense riches came his way after victories, he distributed them among the poor and the families of martyrs. Near the end of his life, it was said that he owned little more than the clothes he wore. This humility was a reflection of his heart, a heart not driven by material gain but by spiritual purpose. His followers learned from him that the true wealth of a man lies in his faith, honor, and service to others. Salahuddin's success also reshaped the perception of leadership among his people. He showed that authority is not about dominance, but about responsibility. His decisions were rooted in justice, even when they were difficult or unpopular. He believed that a ruler should fear oppressing his subjects more than he fears losing his throne. This principle became a cornerstone of his legacy, guiding future generations of leaders who sought to emulate his example. In a time when might often defined right, Salahuddin proved that moral courage was the greatest form of power. The story of his revenge transformed into a story of transformation for himself, for his people, and for history. Where once there was division, there was now unity. Where once there was defeat, there was now faith. Salahuddin's journey from loss to leadership reflected a divine pattern, that trials refine the soul and victories reward patience. Every city he rebuilt, every peace treaty he forged, and every act of mercy he showed became a living reminder that the path to greatness begins with enduring hardship with grace. Even as he grew older, his vision never dimmed. He continued to plan, to guide, and to strengthen his empire with the same passion that had fueled his early campaigns. His men respected not only his orders but his example. He remained accessible to the common people, often walking among them without royal guards, listening to their concerns. To them, Salahuddin was not just a distant king. He was a protector who carried the weight of his people's hopes on his shoulders. His connection with them created an unbreakable bond that no army could destroy. The impact of Salahuddin's revenge was felt long after his final battles ended. He didn't just reclaim land, he revived the honor of a nation and restored faith in the power of righteousness. His victories were remembered not for the destruction they caused, but for the peace they established. His story continues to inspire generations to believe that even after the darkest defeat, the light of faith and justice can lead to triumph. The memory of Salahuddin Ayyubi stands as a living testament that true victory belongs to those who conquer not only their enemies, but their own hearts. As the final years of Salahuddin Ayyubi's life unfolded, his journey from defeat to greatness reached its most profound chapter. Though his body grew weaker with age, his spirit remained unshakable. He had seen the rise and fall of empires, the arrogance of kings, and the suffering of the innocent. Yet through it all, he remained devoted to justice and humility. The same man who once stood on battlefields now stood as a symbol of peace and piety. The victories he had won were no longer measured by land or wealth, but by the respect and unity he had cultivated among his people. In those later days, Salahuddin often reflected on the path that had brought him from his first defeat to his final triumph. He saw that every hardship had been a teacher, every loss a test of faith. He understood that true strength comes not from swords or soldiers, but from steadfastness of heart. The memory of his early failure no longer stung. It inspired him. He had turned humiliation into honor, pain into purpose. His journey was proof that defeat, when faced with patience and faith, becomes the foundation of eternal victory. His compassion and humility became legendary. Despite ruling over vast lands and commanding enormous respect, he never allowed pride to touch his heart. When ambassadors from other nations visited his court, they were astonished by his simplicity. There were no golden thrones or extravagant displays of power. Salahuddin sat among his men as one of them, dressed modestly, speaking gently, and listening with care. His presence carried more authority than any symbol of wealth could offer. People followed him not because they feared him, but because they loved and trusted him. Even in times of peace, Salahuddin continued to serve his people as if he were still at war. This time, a war against injustice, corruption, and neglect. He ordered the construction of schools, hospitals, and mosques. He made sure the poor were fed and the widows protected. His attention to the needs of his subjects showed that his leadership was not driven by conquest, but by compassion. He had fought to reclaim lands from the Crusaders, but now he fought to reclaim the hearts of his people, ensuring that they lived with dignity and harmony. His faith guided him until the very end. Salahuddin was known to rise for prayer even in his weakest moments, whispering supplications in the stillness of dawn. Those close to him said his devotion grew deeper as his strength faded. He believed that all his victories, all his fame, and all his struggles were meaningless without the pleasure of Allah. He often reminded his companions that every empire fades, every title disappears, but the reward of sincere faith remains eternal. His humility in success became the crown of his greatness. When illness finally began to take its toll, Salahuddin faced it with the same patience he had shown in battle. He did not complain, nor did he seek comfort in luxury. Instead, he used his remaining strength to settle debts, free captives, and ensure justice continued after his death. He distributed his possessions among the poor, leaving behind almost nothing for himself. When his companions checked his treasury, they found that the man who had ruled one of the greatest empires in history had not even left enough money to cover his burial expenses. His wealth was not in gold, it was in legacy. As the news of his illness spread, people from all walks of life came to pray for him, soldiers, scholars, and citizens alike. Many wept openly, knowing that they were losing not just a ruler, but a protector and father figure. His name had united tribes and nations that had once been divided. His justice had healed wounds deeper than any sword could inflict. When he finally passed away, the sorrow that filled the lands was unlike any other. The world had lost a king but gained a legend. Even after his death, his legacy continued to shape generations. The cities he liberated flourished under peace and prosperity. His model of leadership, rooted in mercy, discipline, and faith, became the standard for rulers who came after him. Historians, both Muslim and non-Muslim, wrote of his character with admiration. Even his former enemies spoke of him with respect, calling him the noblest of kings. His life became a universal example of how true power is exercised through humility, and how victory is meaningless without compassion. Centuries later, Salahuddin's name still echoes through history as a beacon of righteousness. His story is told not just as that of a warrior, but as that of a man who embodied patience, faith, and forgiveness. His revenge was not to destroy, but to rebuild, not to humiliate, but to restore justice. His victories were not moments of pride, but lessons in perseverance. The world remembers him not for his wealth or conquests, but for the purity of his intentions and the strength of his character. Through his life, Salahuddin Ayyubi proved that the greatest empire a man can build is within himself. The empire of faith, discipline, and mercy endures far beyond the walls of any fortress. His story stands as a timeless reminder that defeat is not the end for those who believe, that true leadership comes from serving others, and that the light of faith can turn even the darkest setbacks into the dawn of victory. The story of Salahuddin Ayyubi teaches us one eternal truth: defeat does not define you, how you rise after it does. His revenge was not guided by hatred, but by righteousness. His victory was not fueled by pride, but by purpose. In a world filled with arrogance and injustice, his life reminds us that true power lies in humility, mercy, and unshakable faith. When you fall, remember Salahuddin, stand firm, stay patient, and rise again, because sometimes the path to your greatest victory begins with your greatest test.